You guys know what infatuation is? You know, that part at the beginning of a relationship where you see the other person through rainbow glasses, like everything about them is just perfect. You get the butterflies in your stomach every time that you think about them or you see them when you get to school or whatever. It's this beautiful thing where you just want to get to know the person even better. You're just drawn to this person and it's exciting and it's new and it's fresh. And it's not a bad thing. It's good. It's what draws us to that person. It's what makes us want to get to know that person on a deeper level. It's what captures our attention. Those feelings of infatuation are good for drawing us to a person, but then it's the spiritual and the emotional connection that helps us continue to grow deeper in our relationship with that person. It's the infatuation of a person that initially draws us to them, but we all know that those feelings don't last, and a relationship can't be built upon infatuation because that kind of disappears over time. It's what draws us to a person until the emotional and spiritual connection begin to take root on a much deeper level. And it's that spiritual and emotional and physical bond, those aspects of a relationship that solidify it and make it last. And last week we talked about how sex is designed to be within the context of marriage. And sex has all of those components as well. The aspects of sex are physical, spiritual, and emotional. And you have to have all three of those in working order before you can have a healthy relationship. Unfortunately, in our culture, the running theme that we tend to hear when it comes to sex within marriage is that if you want to kill your sex life, get married. And it's this idea that your relationships are great until you get married and they become stagnant. And that's kind of the idea that a lot of people have when it comes to sex and marriage in our culture today. So sex is supposed to be the culmination of the emotional and the spiritual bond that you have with somebody. But when we take that out of its context, when we go out of order and our relationships become sexual before we have agreed to the spiritual and emotional commitments with the person, then what happens is that sex is associated with the stage of infatuation, which doesn't last, which is why often a lot of marriages stop having sex because they did them out of order. But when you do it in order, when you have made that commitment to somebody that you are spiritually, emotionally, and physically there for that person for the rest of their life, then the sex becomes the concrete that cements your relationship together in a way that it's not supposed to ever be broken apart. That's why when you're in a dating relationship, the person you're dating doesn't have the same privileges that they get when you're married. So they don't get to have a big influence on what you decide to do for college. They don't get to determine certain decisions that you make for your life. You don't sacrifice all your time with friends and family to just be with that person. There's balance. They haven't committed to every part of your life yet, and you haven't committed to them yet before marriage. And so there are certain benefits that they don't get until you say, I do. So here's the truth for this week. You were made for more than sex. You were made for covenantal relationships. Paul says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, he says, so Christ has truly set us free. Now make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. And he says again in Romans chapter 6, verse 16, he says, don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living, or I would say freedom in Christ. Because when you live your life choosing to be a slave to what God has said about the way He's designed us, then we experience the satisfaction and freedom that comes with that. But when we don't, when we take things out of their proper order, we reap those consequences. So while there's more to sex than just the physical, there's the spiritual and the emotional, there's also more to life and to our relationships than just sex, which is why it shouldn't be prioritized at the beginning of a relationship. It's not about whether you can do something. It's about whether you should. It's about making wise choices. And not only can something not be good for you, it can also take control of you. And so if we are to be the boss of our own bodies, if we're to prioritize what God says before what we want, then this takes discipline and it takes hard work. Sexual integrity is not easy. We talked about this a little bit last week. So I'm gonna have you guys watch another video that's by Elevation Youth, and they talk about this in a more practical way about, what our boundaries should actually look like in a high school dating relationship context. So you'll watch this video and then you'll have some discussion with your group. I hope this series has been beneficial for you and eye-opening and just encouraging as we try to study together what God has to say about the important parts of our lives, including having healthy relationships and healthy sex lives.